Do you remember Doris Duke? For most of the 20th century, she was the richest woman in America. But behind the fortune and the famous lovers was a life marked by loss, betrayal, and a death so strange, people are still asking questions about it decades later. One night behind the gates of her own estate, something happened that would follow her forever, and it's far from the only secret she carried. Stick around, because this story only gets stranger from here. The richest girl in the world. Before the scandals, before the heartbreak, and before the whispers that would follow her for the rest of her life, Doris Duke was simply an infant, born into more money than almost anyone on earth could imagine. She was born on November 22nd, 1912, in New York City, the only child of James Buchanan Duke, the tobacco magnate who had built the American Tobacco Company into one of the most powerful business empires in the country, and who would later help found what became Duke Energy. The moment she was born, newspapers seized on her story, dubbing her the richest little girl in the world, a label that would stick with her for the rest of her life, whether she wanted it or not. Her childhood was anything but ordinary. She split her time between enormous estates, surrounded by servants, tutors, and the kind of wealth that most people could never fully picture. Her mother, Nanaline Duke, was a formal, distant woman from a modest southern background who had married into extraordinary wealth herself, and the relationship between mother and daughter was never especially warm. Rumours swirled for years about the Duke household, including dark whispers that Nanaline had hastened her ailing husband's death by leaving him locked in a room with the windows open during his final illness, though nothing was ever proven, and much of it likely belonged more to legend than fact. When Doris was just 12 years old, her father died, leaving her the bulk of his fortune, an inheritance reported at the time to be around $100 million, an almost incomprehensible sum in the 1920s. Overnight, a preteen girl became one of the wealthiest people on the planet, and the American public could not get enough of her story. She grew up in the shadow of the Great Depression, untouched by the financial devastation crushing the rest of the country, and the contrast made her an object of endless fascination and often resentment in the newspapers of the era. It's worth pausing on just how strange that must have felt from the inside. While families across the country lined up for bread and struggled to keep their homes, a teenage girl was being chauffeured between mansions, tutored privately, and photographed in designer clothing for magazine spreads. Duke later admitted that the disconnect weighed on her more than people realized at the time, and that the sense of being watched, judged, and endlessly discussed by strangers who knew nothing about her actual life left a mark that never fully faded, even decades later when she had every resource imaginable at her disposal. Unlike many of her wealthy peers, Doris Duke never seemed entirely comfortable with the spotlight that came attached to her fortune. She was often described as shy, guarded, and deeply wary of people who seemed too eager to get close to her, a wariness that her father had reportedly instilled in her directly, famously advising her to trust no one. It was a lesson she would carry with her through decades of relationships, marriages, and friendships, many of which would end in heartbreak, betrayal, or worse. As she came of age in the 1930s, the press had already crowned her half of a famous rivalry, alongside another young heiress born just days apart from her, a Woolworth fortune heir named Barbara Hutton. Together, the newspapers nicknamed them the Gold Dust Twins, two young women whose lives seemed destined to be compared, contrasted, and endlessly scrutinized by a public who couldn't look away. A whirlwind marriage and a tropical escape. At 22 years old, Doris Duke did something that stunned the social circles she had grown up in. In 1935, she married James Cromwell, a divorced, politically ambitious man, 16 years her senior. someone she had really only known for a relatively short time before the wedding. Cromwell was charming, well-connected, and hungry for a political career, and many observers at the time speculated that he saw in Duke not just a partner, but a source of funding and influence that could carry him toward elected office. The wedding itself was conducted with an almost secretive haste, a stark contrast to the extravagant, headline-grabbing weddings the public had come to expect from an heiress of Duke's stature. Friends and family were reportedly caught off guard by how quickly the courtship moved from introduction to marriage, and gossip columnists spent months afterwards speculating about what exactly had drawn the shy, guarded young heiress to a man so clearly focused on his own ambitions. Whatever her private reasons, Duke committed herself fully to the marriage in its early years, eager to build a life and a partnership that felt entirely her own, separate from the shadow of her father's fortune and her mother's cool detachment. The couple embarked on an extraordinary honeymoon that stretched across nearly 2 years, traveling through the Middle East and Asia, collecting art and cultural artifacts along the way that would shape Duke's lifelong passion for architecture and design. It was during this journey that the couple made their way to Hawaii, intending to stay for only a short visit. What began as a planned 2-week stop stretched into 3 months, and Duke fell completely in love with the islands, their culture, and the sense of freedom she felt so far from the pressures of the mainland. While in Honolulu, the couple built an extraordinary estate they named Shangri-La, inspired by the mythical land from popular fiction where no one grows old. It became one of the most remarkable private homes ever constructed in America, blending Islamic architecture with sweeping ocean views, and it would remain one of Duke's most cherished possessions for the rest of her life. Construction of the estate stretched on for years, with Duke personally overseeing nearly every design decision, importing tile work, carved doors, and decorative ceilings from across the Islamic world to create a home unlike anything else in the Hawaiian Islands at the time. It was also in Hawaii that Duke formed a close friendship with the Kahanamoku family, including the legendary waterman Duke Kahanamoku, and she became one of the first prominent women to surf competitively on the islands, a passion that stayed with her for years. For Duke, the appeal of Hawaii went far beyond the scenery. The islands offered her something she had rarely experienced growing up in the glare of East Coast society, a sense of genuine warmth and acceptance among people who seemed far less interested in her fortune than in who she actually was. She spent hours in the water with the Kahanamoku brothers and the local beach boys, learning to surf and building friendships that felt entirely unlike anything from her earlier life. Friendships built around shared afternoons in the ocean rather than formal dinners and society columns. But it was also during this period that rumours began to circulate, rumours that would set the tone for the rest of Duke's romantic life. Whispers suggested she had grown close to Kahanamoku's younger brother, Sam, during her time in Hawaii, far closer than a married woman typically would to a man who wasn't her husband. When Duke became pregnant in 1940, speculation about the child's true father spread through gossip circles almost immediately. Tragically, the baby, a daughter named Arden, was born prematurely on July 11, 1940, and lived for only about a day. It was a devastating loss for Duke, one that she rarely spoke about publicly for the rest of her life, and one that would leave her unable to have children of her own ever again. The marriage that fell apart. The loss of her daughter marked a turning point in Duke's first marriage, one from which the relationship never fully recovered. Cromwell continued pursuing his political ambitions throughout their marriage, and in 1940 he was appointed United States ambassador to Canada, a position that pulled the couple further apart, both physically and emotionally. Duke had initially supported her husband's career, even attempting to campaign on his behalf. but the press remained far more interested in her than in him, a dynamic that reportedly created growing resentment between them. By the early 1940s, the marriage had become largely a formality, and rumours of Duke's romantic entanglements outside the relationship only grew louder. She was linked in gossip columns to a long list of famous and powerful men during this period, including the war hero General George S. Patton and the swashbuckling actor Errol Flynn, though many of these rumours were never confirmed and likely grew larger with each retelling in the press. What remained consistent, however, was the sense that Duke's marriage to Cromwell was crumbling under the weight of distance, grief, and mutual disillusionment. The couple officially divorced in 1943, closing the door on a union that had begun with such extraordinary promise less than a decade earlier. Looking back, friends of the couple often described the marriage as one built more on ambition and companionship than genuine romantic passion, a partnership that made sense on paper, but never quite found its footing once real life and real tragedy entered the picture. For Duke, the divorce marked the end of her first real attempt at building a conventional family life, and by most accounts, it left her more guarded than ever about trusting the men who came into her orbit afterward. Following the divorce, Duke spent the remainder of the war years working as a foreign correspondent, an unusual and largely self-directed career path for a woman of her wealth and status. She reported from Europe during the final stretch of the Second World War, immersing herself in a world entirely different from the sheltered life she had known growing up. It was during this period, while unwinding one evening with friends, that Duke was introduced to a man who would become the second great romantic storm of her life, a Dominican diplomat with a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. The Playboy Diplomat. His name was Porfirio Rubirosa, and by the time Duke met him in the mid-1940s, he had already built an international reputation as one of the most notorious playboys in the world. Rubirosa served as a diplomat for the Dominican Republic under the regime of dictator Rafael Trujillo, but his fame had far less to do with his official duties than with his personal life, which seemed to move from one glamorous romance to the next with dizzying speed. Duke, who had spent years wary of men chasing her fortune, found herself completely captivated by him anyway. Rubirosa's charm was, by nearly every account from the era, extraordinary and almost impossible to describe secondhand. He raced cars, played championship-level polo, and moved through the glamorous capitals of Europe with an ease that made him a fixture of high society gossip columns for decades. For a woman who had spent her entire life being pursued for her money, there was something almost disarming about a man so thoroughly, unapologetically pursued by everyone else, a dynamic that flipped the usual script Duke had grown so wary of throughout her adult life. There was, however, one significant complication. At the time Duke and Rubirosa began their relationship, he was already married to the French actress Danielle Darrieux. According to widely circulated accounts from the era, Duke was so determined to have Rubirosa for herself that she arranged a substantial payment, reportedly around $1 million, to persuade Darrieux to agree to a divorce. Whether every detail of that story is entirely accurate remains debated among biographers, but what is clear is that Rubirosa and Darrieux's marriage did end, and by September of 1947, Duke and Rubirosa were married. The marriage, however, proved to be short-lived and famously turbulent. Rubirosa's reputation for infidelity did not fade simply because he had a new wife, and reports of his continued romantic entanglements with other women followed the couple throughout their brief time together. Before the wedding, the United States government had reportedly insisted on an extremely strict prenuptial agreement to protect Duke's fortune, a clear sign of just how much scrutiny and suspicion surrounded the relationship even before it began. By October of 1948, just over a year after their wedding, Duke and Rubirosa divorced. What happened next revealed just how deeply personal the rivalry between Duke and her old friend and fellow heiress, Barbara Hutton, truly ran. Not long after the divorce, Rubirosa moved on to marry Hutton herself, a development Duke reportedly discovered while staying in Geneva, when she saw the headline announcing the marriage splashed across a newspaper. According to later accounts, Duke's reaction was anything but composed, and she spent the following hours drinking heavily and venting furiously about Hutton to anyone nearby, insisting that her old rival had always wanted whatever Duke had for herself. It was a strikingly human moment from a woman the world usually saw only as a distant, untouchable figure of enormous wealth. The rivalry between the two heiresses had, in many ways, defined both of their public images since childhood. Two women born within days of each other in 1912, each inheriting an almost identical kind of overwhelming fortune, and each handling the pressure of that inheritance in strikingly different ways. Where Hutton seemed to embrace the tabloid attention and moved through husband after husband over the following decades, Duke retreated further from the spotlight with each passing year, choosing instead a quieter, more private form of independence. After the divorce from Rubirosa, Duke never married again, choosing instead to spend the following decades pursuing relationships on her own terms, far from the formality of marriage and its legal entanglements. A life without rules. Freed from the pressures of marriage, Duke spent much of the following decades traveling the world in search of meaning, beauty, and connection. She visited mystics in India, spent time with tribal communities in Africa, and continued amassing one of the most impressive private art collections in the country, focused heavily on Islamic and Southeast Asian pieces that reflected her deep fascination with cultures far removed from her own privileged upbringing. She poured enormous resources into her various properties, including her beloved Shangri-La in Hawaii, her historic Rough Point mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, and additional homes in New Jersey, Beverly Hills, and New York City. Throughout these years, Duke maintained a long list of close companions and romantic relationships, though she remained famously guarded about her private life, refusing most interview requests and shying away from the kind of publicity that had defined her early years. She surrounded herself with musicians, artists, and unconventional friends, and by many accounts, she found far more comfort in these looser, less formal relationships than she ever had in either of her two marriages. It was during this period that one particular companion became especially important to her, a relationship that would ultimately end in one of the most infamous and disputed moments of her entire life. The companion who never left her side. For roughly a decade, one of the most constant presences in Doris Duke's life was a man named Eduardo Tirella, an interior designer and curator who worked closely with her across several of her properties. Tirella helped Duke shape the interiors and art displays of her various estates, and over the years, their working relationship grew into something much closer, a deep friendship built on shared taste, long conversations, and mutual trust in a world where Duke trusted almost no one. By most accounts, Tirella was one of the very few people in Duke's orbit who genuinely seemed to care about her as a person, rather than as a source of money or status. Those who knew them both during this period often described Tirella as one of the only people who could speak to Duke with total honesty, someone unafraid to disagree with her design choices or push back on her opinions, a rarity among the many staff members and hangers-on who typically surrounded her. He had spent 10 years working across her 5 different estates, curating art and shaping interiors with an eye that Duke deeply respected, and their bond had grown far beyond a simple professional arrangement into something resembling a genuine, if complicated, partnership. On the evening of October 7th, 1966, Duke and Tyrella were preparing to leave her Rough Point estate in Newport together. It was an ordinary routine the two had performed countless times before. Tyrella would drive the car down the long driveway, step out to open the heavy iron gates at the entrance, and then Duke would slide over and take the wheel to pull the car through before he closed the gates behind them. On this particular evening, however, something went catastrophically wrong. As Tyrella stood in front of the vehicle working the gates, the car suddenly lurched forward at high speed, pinning him against the iron gate before crashing through it entirely and coming to a stop against a nearby tree. Tyrella died at the scene from the injuries he sustained, and the initial police investigation, completed remarkably quickly, ruled the incident an unfortunate accident, accepting Duke's account that she had mistakenly hit the accelerator instead of the brake. Given her enormous wealth and standing in Newport society, questions were immediately raised about whether the investigation had been rushed, or whether her influence in the small, tightly connected community had shaped the outcome. In the days that followed, Duke was questioned by police more than once, and each time she was released without any charges filed, a resolution that struck many observers at the time as unusually swift given the severity of what had happened. Tyrella's family later pursued a wrongful death lawsuit against Duke, which ultimately ended in a private settlement rather than a public trial, leaving many of the deeper questions about that night formally unanswered. For decades, the story remained largely settled in the public record as a tragic accident, but it never fully faded from local memory in Newport. In the years that followed the crash, Duke made a series of significant charitable donations across the city, including contributions connected to the local police department and various preservation causes. And while there has never been any confirmed link between those donations and the handling of the case, the timing has fueled speculation among Newport residents for generations. Then, in more recent years, a journalist who grew up in the area revisited the case in a book that re-examined the original police findings, arguing that the evidence painted a far more troubling picture than the official account had ever acknowledged. A witness who had been a young paperboy at the scene that evening, and who had never previously spoken to investigators, came forward decades later with an account that differed from what had been recorded in 1966. Local police reopened a formal review of the case, and while the detective assigned to re-examine it found the witness credible, she ultimately concluded there was no new evidence substantial enough to overturn the original ruling of an accident. To this day, what truly happened at those gates remains one of the most debated and unsettling chapters connected to Duke's entire life, a mystery that outlived nearly everyone directly involved in it. Retreat into isolation. In the years following Tyrella's death, Doris Duke withdrew further from public life than ever before. She had always been guarded, but the tragedy at Rough Point seemed to deepen that instinct considerably, and she increasingly surrounded herself with a smaller, tightly controlled circle of staff and companions, rather than seeking out new relationships. She continued splitting her time between her various estates, pouring enormous energy and money into historic preservation efforts, particularly in Newport, where she quietly funded the restoration of countless colonial-era buildings that might otherwise have been lost to demolition or decay. This period of her life revealed a side of Duke that rarely made headlines, a genuine and sustained commitment to preserving history and culture that went far beyond simple philanthropy for its own sake. She personally walked the streets of Newport, identifying buildings at risk of being torn down, and quietly purchased and restored dozens of them, often without ever publicly attaching her name to the effort. It was, in many ways, the same instinct that had led her to build Shangri-La decades earlier, a desire to preserve beauty and craftsmanship in a world that seemed increasingly willing to discard it. Publicly, she became something of a phantom figure, a woman whose name still carried enormous weight in American culture, but whose actual daily life remained almost entirely hidden from view. She rarely gave interviews, avoided photographers whenever possible, and allowed almost no one outside her immediate circle to get close to her. It was a stark contrast to the earlier decades of her life, when she had been one of the most photographed and gossiped about women in the country. But as Duke moved into her 60s and 70s, an entirely new and deeply strange chapter of her story was about to begin, one involving a young woman who would come to occupy a role unlike anyone else who had ever entered Duke's life. The daughter she chose. In 1985, when Duke was well into her 70s, she met a 32-year-old woman named Chandi Hefner, a devoted follower of the Hare Krishna spiritual movement. The two women formed an immediate and intense bond, one that Duke came to interpret through the lens of her own deep interest in reincarnation and Eastern spirituality. Duke had never fully recovered from the loss of her infant daughter, Arden, decades earlier, and she reportedly became convinced that Hefner was, in some spiritual sense, the reincarnation of the daughter she had lost. For a woman who had spent her entire life believing that almost everyone around her wanted something from her, the connection with Hefner must have felt like something entirely different. A relationship rooted not in Duke's fortune or social standing, but in shared belief and genuine companionship. Duke showered Hefner with extraordinary gifts, including $1 million ranch property in Hawaii, and the two women grew remarkably close, living together for extended periods at Shangri-La, where they practiced yoga and meditation and hosted spiritual gatherings for like-minded guests from around the world. In 1988, Duke made the extraordinary decision to legally adopt Hefner as her daughter, despite Hefner being a fully grown adult in her 30s at the time, a decision that stunned many people close to Duke and set off years of legal and personal complications that would follow long after Duke's own death. For a while, the bond between the two women seemed to bring Duke a sense of family and purpose she had rarely experienced since the loss of Arden. But as the years passed, cracks began to form in the relationship. Duke reportedly grew increasingly suspicious of Hefner's intentions, wondering whether her adopted daughter's affection was genuine or whether it, too, was ultimately tied to Duke's enormous fortune. The same fear that had shadowed nearly every relationship in Duke's life since childhood. By the early 1990s, the relationship between Duke and Hefner had deteriorated into open hostility, and Duke made moves to formally remove Hefner from her will and her life altogether, setting the stage for a bitter legal battle that would explode into public view after Duke's death. The butler who took control. It was through Chandi Hefner, somewhat ironically, that another figure entered Duke's life who would end up playing an even larger and more controversial role in her final years. Hefner introduced an Irish-born household worker named Bernard Lafferty into Duke's orbit, and Lafferty was eventually hired as her personal butler in the mid-1980s. Lafferty had grown up in modest circumstances in rural Ireland, losing both of his parents by the time he was a teenager, and he had worked his way through a series of service jobs, including a stint working for the singer Peggy Lee, before landing in Duke's employ. Those who worked alongside Lafferty in the Duke household often described him as an unusual and somewhat theatrical presence, a man who developed an unmistakable devotion to his employer over the years, one that some staff members found endearing and others found unsettling given the sheer scale of trust and access he was eventually granted. As Duke's relationship with Hefner began to sour, Lafferty's influence within the household grew steadily. He became one of the people Duke trusted most in her final years, a remarkable turn for a man who had started as simply one member of her domestic staff. During a period when Duke fell mysteriously ill at her Hawaii estate in the early 1990s, and later suffered a fall that left her unconscious, Lafferty reportedly encouraged suspicions that Hefner and her boyfriend at the time were conspiring against Duke's interests, further widening the rift between Duke and the woman she had once considered her spiritual daughter. Following that period, Duke severed her relationship with Hefner almost entirely, and Lafferty's control over her household and her daily life expanded even further until he had become the single most influential person in her orbit, overseeing everything from her medical care to her finances. As Duke moved into her late 70s, her health became increasingly fragile, and Lafferty reportedly encouraged her to undergo a series of medical procedures, including a facelift and a knee replacement surgery that ultimately failed, leaving her permanently reliant on a wheelchair. Those close to the household later described a woman who had become increasingly frail, disoriented, and isolated, surrounded almost entirely by a small circle of staff who controlled access to her and, increasingly, decisions about her care and her finances. A stark and troubling reversal for a woman who had spent her entire life fiercely guarding her own independence. The final months. In April of 1993, in the final months of her life, Duke signed a new will that named Lafferty as the primary beneficiary of her estate, a staggering shift in control over a fortune estimated at well over $1 billion. Given her declining physical and mental state at the time, the timing and circumstances surrounding that decision would later become the subject of intense scrutiny and legal dispute. Not long afterward, according to later accounts from members of her household staff, a troubling incident occurred in which Duke began choking on food and Lafferty reportedly delayed calling for emergency medical help, a claim that would later fuel some of the darkest suspicions surrounding her final months. By this point, the woman once known across the world for her sharp intellect, her guarded independence, and her refusal to let anyone control her, had, according to those closest to the situation, become almost entirely dependent on the handful of people managing her daily care. It was a devastating final chapter for someone who had spent her entire adult life fiercely protecting her own autonomy, and it left lingering questions that no legal settlement could ever fully answer about who was truly acting in her best interest during those final, fragile months. Duke spent much of that final summer cycling in and out of hospital care, her condition steadily worsening. When she returned home for the last time, she was kept heavily medicated with painkillers, including morphine, administered under circumstances that former staff members would later describe as troubling. On October 28, 1993, just weeks before what would have been her 81st birthday, Doris Duke died at her Beverly Hills estate. In an unusual and, to many observers, deeply suspicious decision, no autopsy was performed, and her body was cremated within 24 hours of her death, with her ashes ultimately scattered into the Pacific Ocean. The speed of her cremation, combined with the timing of her final will and the allegations swirling around her care in those last months, set off a firestorm that would consume her estate for years to come, and it would force the public to confront uncomfortable questions about how one of the wealthiest women in the world had spent her final days almost entirely at the mercy of the people closest to her. The battle over billions. Duke's death did not bring closure to her story. Instead, it ignited one of the most contentious inheritance battles in modern American history. Bernard Lafferty, now the named executor of an estate valued at roughly $1.2 billion, found himself at the center of a swirling storm of accusations, lawsuits, and public suspicion. Chandy Hefner, despite having been formally cut out of Duke's final will, mounted a legal challenge to reclaim her position as Duke's legally adopted daughter, and several former household staff members came forward with sensational and deeply unsettling allegations, including claims that Duke's final months had been mishandled to the point of contributing directly to her death. The court battles that followed dragged on for years and grew increasingly complicated, with a rotating cast of executors, lawyers, and claimants all fighting over control of the enormous estate. At various points in the years before her death, Duke had rewritten her will multiple times, cycling through different executors, including her personal physician, her accountant, and eventually a combination of Lafferty, a distant relative, and a major financial institution, changes that later fueled speculation about just how much influence the people around her were exerting during a period when her judgment may have already been compromised by illness and heavy medication. Authorities in Los Angeles opened an investigation into the circumstances surrounding her final medical care, examining whether the doses of morphine and other medications administered to her in her final days had played a role in hastening her death. No criminal charges were ever ultimately filed against Lafferty or anyone else connected to her care. But the investigation, combined with the ongoing civil litigation, kept Duke's name in headlines for years after her passing, transforming a woman who had spent decades trying to avoid public scrutiny into the subject of one of the most talked-about legal sagas of the decade. Eventually, after years of legal wrangling, Lafferty reached a settlement that saw him step back from direct control of the massive charitable foundation established in Duke's name, though he retained a significant personal financial settlement from the estate. He used part of that fortune to purchase a multi-million-dollar mansion in Bel Air, a dramatic transformation for a man who had begun his working life as an orphaned farm boy in rural Ireland. He would not enjoy that fortune for long. In November of 1996, just 3 years after Duke's death, Lafferty died alone in that same mansion, reportedly of a heart attack, closing one of the strangest and most debated chapters connected to Duke's entire life. The legacy she left behind. Despite the chaos and controversy that surrounded her final years and the years immediately following her death, Doris Duke's legacy ultimately grew into something far larger than the scandal and speculation that once dominated the headlines. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, established according to her wishes, went on to distribute hundreds of millions of dollars over the following decades, funding causes ranging from the arts and medical research to environmental conservation and the preservation of historic buildings, particularly across Newport, the very city where the darkest chapter of her personal story had unfolded decades earlier. It stands today as one of the largest and most influential charitable foundations in the country, a legacy that has quietly reshaped entire fields of research and preservation, even as most of the public who benefits from its funding has little idea of the turbulent life story behind the name attached to it. Her extraordinary properties, including Shangri-La in Honolulu and Rough Point in Newport, were eventually opened to the public as museums, allowing visitors from around the world to walk through the same rooms Duke once filled with priceless art and endless private gatherings, offering a glimpse into a life that had spent so many decades hidden behind closed gates and guarded silence. Tour guides at both estates still field the same questions year after year, not about the artwork hanging on the walls, but about the woman herself, about what really happened at those iron gates in Newport, about the daughter she never had and the one she chose instead, about a life that seemed to have everything except the one thing money could never buy her. For those who remember her name from the tabloid headlines of decades past, Doris Duke tends to linger in the memory as a collection of striking, almost cinematic images: a young heiress falling for a Hawaiian surfer beneath swaying palm trees, a devastated bride reading of her ex-husband's remarriage in a foreign newspaper, a woman behind the wheel of a car on a quiet Newport evening, and a frail, isolated figure surrounded by staff she could no longer be certain she could trust. Each chapter of her life seemed to circle back to the same lesson her father had given her as a child: the quiet, haunting advice to trust no one. a lesson that shaped nearly every relationship she ever had, for better and for so much worse. Decades after her death, Doris Duke's story continues to fascinate new generations discovering it for the first time, not simply because of the staggering size of her fortune, but because of how deeply human her struggles turned out to be underneath all that wealth. The same longing for love and loyalty that everyone can recognize, playing out against a backdrop of mansions, secrets, and tragedy that very few people will ever experience firsthand. It's a strange kind of legacy for a woman who spent so much of her life trying to disappear from public view, that the very privacy she guarded so fiercely has only made people more determined to understand who she really was, long after she was ever able to tell them herself. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.